much. It's always good to be with you, and particularly on a lovely day, and particularly when we have some good news about the economy. So we celebrate little things and big things. The economy is operating below its norm. We'll look at that rather closely and talk about why, at least attempt to identify some of the forces that are causing us to be operating on what I can call a 2-lane interstate highway instead of a 3-lane. That is, we're growing at 2% annually instead of 3% annually. So we've lost 1/3 of our productivity as an economy. We'll talk about that some. There are also pockets of prosperity. As we look across the country or within a given state, there are significant differences in outcomes. So when we talk about how the U.S. economy is doing, and we will a good bit, in a sense, nobody lives at that zip code. It's the nation, it's the backdrop that begins to affect life and economies where people do live. For example, when we look at the unemployment rate across states, we see that very low North Dakota, 2.7%. Or we can drop on down to Nebraska and see a 3.2, or we can go way down to Nevada and see a 9.5. Large differences in the unemployment rate. Quite often I have opportunities to have coffee with university students, and one of the things that's always on the minds of those who are graduating this year is, where will I find a job? And when they ask me for advice, I always say, you should look at North Dakota. And now you can imagine the response that comes back. What's the response? It's always the same, no matter where I am, whether I'm giving this lecture in Boston or New York City or in South Carolina, the response is always the same when I say, go to North Dakota. They say, doesn't it get cold there? And I said, yes, and if that really bothers you, go to South Dakota. All right. Or if you would like, get on down to Colorado or visit those wonderful square states in the middle of the map. That's where America's economy is strongest. But we do have these pockets of prosperity. If we get into states, for example, in South Carolina, Marion County has an unemployment rate of 14.4%. And then we move up in that little postage stamp size territory called South Carolina. We move to Lancaster County, which is close to where the capital is. And you're looking at 6.2. So you can move a very small distance in any state in the U.S. and encounter wide variations in prosperity. And that's always the case. But as we think about how the economy is doing, in terms of subtitles, I've made reference to prospering and relative levels of prosperity. We want to talk about that and tapering, which seems to be at the front of everyone's mind who is an economy watcher or an investor, for good reasons, and then talk about producing. The next challenge is trying to find 8.3 million Waldos. Those are the people who are missing from our labor force. And so we want to identify, where are those 8.3 million people, and why are they not in the labor force? Then talk about the underground economy, which may be where some of these Waldos are located. We have a burgeoning underground economy that is estimated to be equal to about $2 trillion annually in GDP, a loss of $500 billion annually in income taxes coming out of this shadow economy or underground economy. We'll want to talk about that, and then prospects for 2014. But I want to go back to the background for this slide. Does anyone recognize what we're looking at there? Other than the petunias in the planter. It's a swarm of bees. And so we're looking at a swarm of bees, and when you see a swarm of bees, you are seeing a political body making a decision in motion. Bees, like people, can encounter deficits in their locations, which is to say their population begins to exceed their revenues, or either their sources of revenue, pollen, in the location where they have been stationed, begin to diminish And so they have a dietary deficit. This happens in the lives of bees all the time. Now, when they hit that deficit problem, it means they have to move and find a new location. And the interesting thing about this is they go through a political process of voting. When you study bees and their behavior, you find out that when they have a budget problem, they send out scouts. And the scouts begin to identify competing locations. They come back and do a particular kind of highly stylized dance that advertises the new potential location, and the movement of the dance points to it so that others can go and check it out. And so when they have their meeting of their General Assembly, competing proposals are offered, and then they vote. And until they get a consensus, they might be like this, still debating. Now, if this intrigues you, I recommend you read Seeley's book, Honeybee Democracy. So bees, like people, have to deal with deficits, and they have to deal with politics. So far as we know, no scientist has ever identified whether bees have political parties or not. Maybe they do. And I expect if some scientists would get far enough away from us and watch our behavior, we might not be unlike these bees as we have to grapple with deficits and solutions. And so now we have some wonderful news, I think, that is coming, and that is we've made some progress, what I would call progress. I considered sequestration meaningful progress for a democracy. What some people described as an insane meat-axe approach to addressing a problem, well, welcome to a democracy. As we made some progress, and now it appears to me we have a second step with some concrete that may be placed around it. Now, I'm showing you how the economy performs. Here we're looking at GDP growth. This chart includes the most recent, we got this data last week, GDP estimate for the third quarter. As you probably know, we get 3 indicators of GDP growth when the Department of Commerce is generating the numbers. There's an early estimate, and the early estimate for third quarter was 2.8%. Hey, that sounded pretty good. Then last week we got the second revision, 3.5%. And that's what you're looking at here in the chart. Wow, that is one big number. But if you, well, my grandmother always said, never look a gift horse in the mouth, but our purpose here is to look at the data and figure out what is going on. When you look at the 3.5% growth that has been estimated by the Commerce Department for the third quarter, you will see that 1.68 percentage points of that relates to a buildup of inventories. In other words, we were producing a lot of stuff, 3.5% annual rate in that third quarter, but the level of purchases actually went down. That is, consumer spending was down, government spending was down, investment was down. What was up was buildup of inventories. And that always raises a question, a risk, a data risk, because it suggests that if that buildup in inventories was more than manufacturers and retailers expected, which is to say people didn't buy as much as they thought they would, then they will reduce their orders in the fourth quarter. So when we see a buildup of growth in GDP data that is driven significantly by inventory buildup, we can usually forecast with some accuracy that the next quarter's growth will be pale by comparison. But when we look at this, the red line that you're looking at here is the long-term growth rate of our economy. When I refer to the economy as though we were operating on a 2-lane interstate with 1 lane closed, it was 3 lanes before they put the barrels up. I was referring to the fact that the long-run average growth is 3.14%, call it 3 for back-of-envelope calculations. And the white line that you see here is a 4-quarter moving average. And so any point on the white line tells you what the growth rate is for a 12-month period. And so you can see the gap between the most current estimate, 3.8, and the 4-quarter moving average. And that gives us the gap between current and present and the fact that the economy is not doing so well. I'm pointing out here the most recent spike, and I call your attention to 2003 because we have to go back that far to find a period of time where the economy was really accelerating above its long-term average. So we have to go back 10 years. So we've got this subpar economy, but the prospects for improvement are very positive. What I'm showing you here is the Institute of Supply Chain Management's indicators for the manufacturing economy, and then the second one up in the Northeast is for all the rest of the economy, which they call the non-manufacturing economy. The magic number is 50. Anytime their index exceeds 50, we are in a growth situation. Everything you see in these two charts is above 50. Down at the bottom is the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity Improvements Index, and that's a leading index. The two top charts show you current picture. The bottom chart shows you what the economy should be doing 9 months from now. And so the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity Improvement shows a lot of muscle, a lot of strength in the year ahead. And so be optimistic. Now, there's one other report that is turned out by Ohio University, and it's called the Middle Market Index. The Middle Market Index is based on data which they compile from firms that have from $10 million to $1 billion in annual sales. That's the middle of the American economy. That middle of the American economy in the last 12 months has generated 7 out of every 10 new jobs. That's how important it is. That's where our growth is. The most recent year, that middle indicator has added 1.25 million jobs in the economy. Now I'll tell you about the most recent survey. The most recent survey indicates that the growth rate of employment is going to be 1 million, not 1,250,000. When they asked the respondents, why are you cutting back? In one word, the answer was uncertainty. There is uncertainty about monetary policy. When will the tapering start? There was uncertainty about fiscal policy. When will Congress come to grips with the deficit problem? There was uncertainty about regulatory policy. Only about 40% of the rules associated with Dodd-Frank have been finalized. So there's 60% unknown. And there is something called regime uncertainty. Regime uncertainty says, I can't predict what the king will do. And so when you put all this stuff that I have mentioned, the uncertainties that I have mentioned, plus immigration policy uncertainty, plus healthcare policy uncertainty, if you put those things in the pot and stir them, you get a total sort of regime uncertainty, and that caused these firms, at least as they describe their own behavior, to cut back on their hiring plans. Now, the other piece of good news has to do with the diminishing deficit. As you look at this chart, the green line is showing revenues and the red line is showing spending, and you're seeing the jaws of that vice gradually close. The difference between the 2 points, the most recent data, which is for second quarter, the difference between those 2 points is about $500 billion. Now, if we revisit now the debate that has come to a head and the decision that may be made today before the end of tomorrow here on the deficit, that deficit plan reduces the deficit over the next 10 years by about $85 billion. Now you can put that into context. We are at $500 billion. Over the next 2 years, it reduces it, according to the Congressional Budget Office, by $23.5 billion. And so you can see how that step affects the deficit. The Congressional Budget Office suggests that when this deal gets made, along with other deals that are already in the works, we will plateau out with a deficit that will be 68% of GDP. which is lower than it has been, and that'll become a steady state level of deficit on out for the next 10 or 15 years, and then it will begin to grow again as a result of baby boomers and Social Security problems and those kinds of issues. But an economy can prosper, we are prospering, with that level of deficit relative to what it has been, depending on the cost of the deficit, which is, of course, determined by the interest rate. And that's a big unknown as to what it will be. In terms of housing starts, I'm showing you data that is the most recent. This takes us through August. The white line is annual housing starts. The red line is the long-run average number of starts annually, which is 1.6 million. You can see where the mountains are above the red line. That's where we have had excess starts when we looked back. You see the most recent going down the sliding board, hitting the bottom, coming up. And if you stare at this a bit, you will see that the prospects for getting to the red line suggest that by 2016, our construction economy will be operating at full force, hitting the norm. Every step along the way is an important step for the economy because it is the construction sector that is hurting most as we attempt to find where is Waldo. Now, here's total employment. This is through October. We're 1.5 million workers away from the peak where we were in December 2007 when the Great Recession started. We're probably there now. We're probably there now. That is, when the next report comes out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it could well be that the gap will be closed. But notice we're getting back to where we were in 2007. That's 6 years later. And there has been significant growth in the labor force during that period of time. And so we have a higher unemployment rate, even though we are achieving a recovery of employment. But doesn't it feel good? These are manufacturer shipments, and that's what's driving our economy by and large. If you draw tangents to this data, you can get a feel for how forceful the growth is. And as we draw a series of tangents, we can see the growth rate flattening, and it flattens out almost to zero. Let me go back. Flattens out almost to zero as we get to the present. And that has been driven primarily by the slowdown in Europe and the difficulties there. But the manufacturing economy is still chugging away, not as much oomph behind it as we have had in the recent past. Major contributor, primarily automotive. Well, people can't do things if they can't borrow money from banks. And I hear a lot of people say the banks aren't lending. Well, here's the data on commercial and industrial loans. And commercial and industrial loans represent the key part of the manufacturing, industrial, and commercial economy's performance. This doesn't include mortgages. It doesn't include consumer lending. Notice that lending is taking place just a little bit below 10% annually. That's the growth rate you're looking at. That's at a pretty high rate. But it's growing from a low level. Now, for a moment, let's think about what Fed policy has been. The banking system as a whole has a guaranteed 100% sure thing from the Fed. They can put their excess reserves in deposit with the Fed, and they get a guaranteed 25 basis points annually return on those funds. 0.25%. Guaranteed, 100% sure thing, no risk. That's a new Fed policy. When FDIC and Comptroller of Currency and Fed regulators go out and visit banks, they usually seem to be in a bad mood. In other words, that's sort of the standard. If you ask a question, the default answer is no. It's not yes. That is, I'm worried about these loans. And the bank officer will say, well, those are the same people we've been lending to for years, and their balance sheets haven't changed. And the regulator will say, we have a tighter standard now. So what we have is a regulatory constraint affecting the banking system that has a huge level of reserves, plus the ability to put excess reserves in at a guaranteed interest rate. And so what's going on? It's my belief that what's going on is an effort for the banking system of the U.S. to heal. There's a large number of non-performing loans out in the banking system. That number's coming down. And so as the banking system heals, one of the things that's driving the healing is the increase in the price of homes. Most of that bad debt that banks hold is related to mortgages. Underwater mortgages get above water when the price of houses go up. That is happening. And so if the Fed or the government were able to target inflation with an inflation rifle and just hit particular sectors and make those prices go up, they would be shooting at the housing and construction sector. And that is happening, not so much because they have the rifle, but we're getting the inflation, the recovering of housing prices. Now here's non-performing loans, U.S. banks, as you see through April 2013. I'm showing you the data for all banks. You can see the peak in 2010. What we're looking at here are the percentage of all loans that are non-performing coming down. You can see the small community banks are in much better shape than the big banks. And one of the reasons the big banks are in pretty bad shape is because there were a lot of arranged marriages where the big banks took over some pretty sick partners so that combination would be healthy enough to keep walking. So now we have recovery of the sick. They're out of the intensive care unit. They are now in a private room. Now they're up and walking down the halls, and their color looks pretty good. They're getting healthy, and they're lending, and now that means our economy is prospering. Now, when I referred to the level of excess reserves, this is the data that gives you the number. This data, as you see, ends in September of 2012. The next slide, I will show you what happens in a year. If you stare at this for a moment, you will see that for most of the years recorded in the chart, the level of excess reserves is 0. That line just runs right along the 0 point. If you or I were running a bank, we would know that the way we make money to pay ourselves our salaries and to pay our shareholders is to make loans. When we get deposits, there's a certain amount of those deposits that we have to put in reserve, and the rest are called excess reserves. Every bank has to report its reserve position every week. And if you and I were the CEOs of a bank and we were instructing our officers as to how to behave with respect to that number every week, I suspect you and I would say, at the end of each week, we don't want to have any excess reserves. We want every dollar to be working, earning. We want them out on the street because that's how we'll pay our salaries and that's how we pay our shareholders. And as you look at the data going back to 1984, that's exactly how the banking system has operated until we get to this Great Recession. Now what you're looking at here is the effect of the quantitative easings. Each quantitative easing involves the Fed creating money out of thin air, turn on the printing press, get out the green ink. And so here are the increases in the money supply, but notice where it goes. It doesn't go out on the street. It goes in excess reserves, and now those excess reserves are earning 25 basis points annually. The most recent increase is not called a quantitative easing. Oh yeah, by the way, I wanted to show you that dimple right there. If you can see it, that's 9/11. That's when 9/11 occurred. The Fed put money in trucks, got it out to the banking system, not knowing what the emergency was, and so there were excess reserves that were created, cleaned up the very next week. Now, that's the most recent, $85 billion per week being placed into the banking system by the Fed, adding to this excess reserve. And now when we look at this, this is where people stare and say, when will tapering begin? When the news broke that the committee chairman had arrived at a proposal for dealing with the deficit and getting us 2 years out, reducing the risk of government shutdown and so forth, when that news broke, my first thought was, wow, that ought to really be refreshing to the stock market tomorrow. Do you know what happened? Did it go up or down? It went down a lot. What was it, 172 points or something in the Dow the next day. So then there's a question, well, why is it that good news, removing a major piece of uncertainty, why is it that that would be viewed as bad news by investors? Well, if you stare a little bit at what happened to interest rates immediately, what do you think happened to interest rates immediately? Yields on bonds, as determined by investors worldwide who buy and sell bonds based on the information they get. Worldwide investors have just read, wow, the United States is coming to grips with its deficit. Will I buy U.S. bonds or sell them? If I buy them, that will make interest rates go down. If I sell them, that'll make interest rates go up. They sold bonds. Interest rates went up. Why would they get out of bonds? Improvements in the prospects for tapering. In other words, when fiscal policy began to look like it was going to be solid, that makes it easier for the Fed to dish out some bad medicine with respect to cutting back on this stuff. When they cut back on this stuff, interest rates will go up, and that'll take the edge off the stock market. So in a sense, we got a dose of that 2 days ago with this resolution. Now, there's always a, sell the rumor by the fact. That was the rumor of change, and we'll see what it looks like when the facts finally come our way. Now, I mentioned a bunch of people that have shown up missing. What you're looking at here is the labor force participation rate. That's the share of the work-age population that is engaged in work on a payroll somewhere or running their own shop. And as you'll know, as you see, the labor force participation rate has gone down, down, down since the recession. If you go back to the red line there, that's December of 2007. If you go back to that red line and say, okay, I want to try to determine how many people that is. In other words, if we had the same participation rate now that we had then, given the work-age population, how many people would it be? And so I calculated that, and it's 8.3 million. So there are 8.3 million people unaccounted for, at least by our measure of people who work. This is 8.3 million of work age that are not working. Now, we don't think 8.3 million suddenly died. And we don't think 8.3 million people are starving to death. I think that would be a false assumption. So there gets to be a question, well, where are they? I mean, we're talking about 8.3 million Waldos. Where are they? Well, I attempted to answer that question, and it turns out that if you look at construction employment data, it looks like about 2 million of them are missing from construction employment. That's how large that loss is currently, about 2 million people. Now, a large number of those 2 million people do not have a high school diploma. They are skilled. They're skilled carpenters, skilled electricians, skilled people at putting up drywall, but they don't have the kinds of skills required of them in a knowledge economy. As I stirred the data, I found another 2 million people are in college. tech colleges, community colleges. There's been a spike in enrollment in higher education. About 2 million people are there that weren't there before. As you look at the data, whammo, it spikes up. Well, why are they in college? Or what would explain that? Lots of things. But the highest cost of being in college are the wages you would be earning if you were working. That's much bigger than tuition. But if you can't get a job, you just got a discount. So if there are no jobs, you can't be earning anything, well, whammo, I think I'll go to college. If I can get a student loan, whammo, that's even better. So we've had a spike in student loans, a spike in enrollment, and that's another 2 million of the 8.3 million people. It looked like to me from my data better than 1 million of them are disabled. There has been a significant growth in the number of people on Social Security disability. There's a spike there. Rules were changed, making it easier to become disabled so that you could earn on average $1,500 a month out of Social Security. And so there's a spike there. The more interesting aspect of the data that I found was entrepreneurs. A lot of these people apparently said, well, if nobody will hire me, I'll hire myself. There's a veritable explosion of new businesses. Over 500,000 per month. Per month during 2009, 2010. A bunch of people hired themselves. They're working out of their homes. They may have bought an F-150 pickup truck secondhand and a nice mower, and they're in the landscaping business. They're doing all kinds of things. Most of those businesses will fail, but a good number will survive. And now when we look at all of this, we say, well, will they come back? Will the 8.3 million come back when things begin to pick up? Well, some of those entrepreneurs will be glad to get back on a payroll when business gets better and job opportunities brighten. A lot of those college students are now investing in their human capital, and they'll pop out as the market improves. But the people on disability, some of them will, but there's a high tax on going to work. You lose the benefits. If you stay disabled, you have it for life. If you go to work, you lose it. And so that and other kinds of welfare benefits become a tax on work because of what you have to give up. And so it's problematic about those numbers. The people in construction will come back, and they're coming back now. So as we think about the 8.3 million, let's look a little bit closer at the unemployment picture. What I'm showing you here are data that reflect the labor force participation rate by educational attainment and the unemployment rate by educational attainment. I call your attention to that green slice of pie. That green slice of pie is for our work-age population without a high school diploma. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimate. Notice, 55% of that work-age population is not employed. 55% not employed. 45% are employed. 60% of those 45% are earning minimum wage. Our nation cannot prosper if 55% of that segment of our population is unemployed. That's the third lane of the expressway that's missing. That's an important piece of it. Can't prosper. Now, if you look at the unemployment rate and participation, look at people with bachelor's degrees or more. 3.8% is the unemployment rate for people over 25 with a bachelor's degree. And look at the labor force participation rate, 75%. And so as we stare at this, we begin to see the big challenge. The big challenge is one of educational attainment that gets us to this problem of declining participation rate. But it's possible. Well, let's just look at something else, though, because I bumped up against it. Now, this is the most challenging data set I will ask you to stare at. I made it blue because my favorite pie is blueberry pie, so I decided that I would use blueberries in this one. Let me tell you what this construct is called. It may be called lots of things. It's called a beverage curve. Not as in Sprite or Coca-Cola, but as in Sir Walter Beveridge, an Englishman who was a great proponent for growing welfare programs back in the 1919s, 1920s. And Beveridge focused a lot on the unemployment rate. As a result of the attention that he gave it, some economists decided they would focus on the relationship between the unemployment rate and the job creation rate. If an economy is creating a lot more jobs, new jobs being created, logic would say the unemployment rate would go down. When the economy is sick and it's not producing a lot of new jobs, the unemployment rate goes up. That's the logic of the Beveridge curve. Now, as you can see, I'm showing you data from 2001 through July of this year. And when I plot the data, you see two distinct populations. There has been a structural shift in that data. It's almost as if you're looking at two worlds. In both worlds, you have the relationship that says when there are more job openings, unemployment goes down in both those worlds. But in the upper array of points, you see that there is a higher level of unemployment associated with higher levels of job openings than in the lower array. I'm really pushing you to keep up with this one now. Now you will see that I colored three of those observations red. The reason I colored those red is because those were months in July, for instance, in all three cases, July of 2007, July of 2008, July of 2009, when the minimum wage went up. We passed legislation that triggered an increase in the minimum wage across 3 years. A 75-cent increase for each year. At the time the legislation was passed, the minimum wage was $5.15, and then it went to $5.85, and the next year it went to add 75 cents to that. And then you get to the current minimum wage of $7.25. Now I'm showing you data, and all I can say is the data suggests that as the minimum wage went up, and it took these three steps, something happened to the data. Now, there's an economist at the University of Chicago that has taken this same data and data similar to it. His name is Casey Mulligan. And Casey took Bureau of Labor Statistics reports and said, hey, it's kind of interesting. In the first two steps, notice the first two steps did not cause a break. The first two steps affected only 2 to 3% of the working force. Only 2 to 3% were affected. The third step affected 4% of the labor force. And so this says that when you raise the minimum wage and you affect a larger share of the labor force, it has an unemployment effect. Everybody knows that. There are exceptions in some studies. But it has an unemployment effect. Now, Casey Mulligan has estimated the count. When we're talking about the 8.3 million, he estimates that 1.2 million, there's a 1.2 million loss in employment in association with this increase and increases in other aspects of the welfare program. And so the Beveridge curve that I show you just says, hey, something's going on here in this data. If you're looking at data and the architecture changes, you're left with a puzzle. Question? That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. So the worst part of that is involved. And so what Mulligan does is does a multivariable modeling, and all I'm showing you is data that would say, we're we've got a shift. Now, the financial crisis is over, but the shift has not come back. The most recent data I'm showing you there is for May of 2013, and it's still on that line. So if it were the financial crisis and the crisis is over and we're getting 3.8% growth in GDP, 3.5% growth in GDP, you would say, my forecast is all those blue points will start coming home. We don't know whether they will or not until those data points come into existence. Now, there's a proposal now that we increase the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. And according to the White House sheet that I looked at this morning, that would affect 15% of the labor force if it were to come into effect. So it's a substantial increase, much larger proportionally than these, affecting 15% of the increase of the labor force. And all that this data suggests to you is that there is a cost associated with changes in minimum wage and other kinds of programs. There are benefits. The people who continue to be employed will celebrate. Now, there are 19 states in the United States that have a higher minimum wage than the federal. The highest is Washington State with $9.25. And so if people in a state are concerned about the minimum wage being low, they know what to do. They pass a state law that sets it higher. So as we look across the states, Washington, D.C., I think, has something like $8.25. As you look across states, what you find is states that have higher cost of living tend to have higher minimum wages. States with low cost of living have lower minimum wages, and there's a risk involved. But it's quite possible that when this unemployment effect took place, these folks did not stop working. They stopped working as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. A couple of economists have just turned out an estimate of the underground economy. How big is it? And their data show that it grew substantially after the financial crisis. The way they estimate the presence of an underground economy is to analyze the amount of currency circulating per capita. The underground economy operates on cash. The preferred denomination of currency is a $100 bill. When was the last time you used one in buying something? I can't even remember the last time I saw one. But there's a huge number of $100 bills circulating in our economy, and the number has increased markedly. Now, Richard Sabula and his colleague, Edward Feige, took data from the Treasury and the Fed in terms of currency circulating in the economy, and then there are other things that would explain an increase. They put those in their model, and they have estimated the size. What I'm showing you in this chart is the value of currency in circulation, and notice the spikes that have occurred, and the red line that you see is for $100 bills. It's huge. There are a lot of people out there who will do a landscape job for you if you pay them in cash. It's one price. If you pay them with a check, it's a higher price. I'll give you an example. There's a lot of work that is being done for barter. I know dentists and doctors who will take you on. They've never offered me anything. They don't want any forecasts about the economy. All right. What I have isn't worth anything in this market. I'm just showing you the tangents to this data that gives you the increase in the currency that is out there. And so, it depends on where you stand as to whether you like this result or not. For people who are worried about people earning a living, they must kind of like this. Because it says that a lot of people who might be having a really tough time because they can't get on a regular payroll have used their creativity and they figured out a way to put food on the table for their families, operating in the cash economy. If you are the IRS and you're worried about the deficit, you're saying, yeah, but they're not paying any taxes. And that's true. But there's another part to our economy to keep up with. This is a regression analysis of the labor force participation rate mapped into currency and circulation. It is one tight fit. That's from 2000 through September of this year. And this data says that when the labor force participation rate goes down, the amount of currency circulating goes up. in our economy, which tells us something about the underground economy. This is a summary here of sort of what I expect we will see in the year ahead. In a sense, it says if you liked this year, you will like next year a little bit better because the prospects are for it being a little bit better. There are also some prospects that interest rates will be higher, but not so high that it will dramatically affect housing starts and construction and consumer purchasing. But this just gives you a summary, and I'm stopping right here. See if you have questions. You've been kind, and I want to thank you for your attention, for participating in Mercator's programs. It's 1 o'clock, but there was one wish that I wanted to extend to you. It comes from the writings of Charles Dickens. In my family, as long as my children would sit still, I read Christmas Carol every Christmas sitting at the fireplace to my children, and it got to be a favorite story. Christmas Carol was published on December 17th, 1843, just about 1 week before Christmas. Dickens was a marvelous entrepreneur, businessman. And some people say it was the book that made Christmas. Dickens was probably not a practicing Christian. He was a deist. And in his writings, he talked about what he was trying to express in his story. But I'm not going to read to you from the Christmas Carol. I'm going to read to you briefly, very briefly, from a very, very short statement he wrote called Christmas Festivities. And I would say this applies to all people, however you might be positioned with respect to religious preferences. He starts with Christmas time, exclamation point. That man must be a misanthrope indeed, whose breast something like a jovial feeling is not roused, in whose mind some pleasant associations are not awakened by the recurrence of Christmas time. So it's a beautiful time of the year. He goes on to say, don't think about all the bad things that have happened to you this year, or the fact that you're living in a smaller apartment than you were last year, or maybe that you can't even buy a good bottle of wine. I'm paraphrasing. Even if you're drinking Kool-Aid, celebrate. Celebrate what we have and the joy of this season. And so that's my Christmas wish to you. Thanks so much for being here. Good luck to you.